My name is David Carrick. I'm the Associate Director for the WVU Industrial Extension and also in charge of our supply chain and scoring efforts that we're working on nationally. Um, if you've been with us for the previous two, welcome back for the third one. If this is your first one, welcome. All these have been recorded along with the session that we did last year, so we can help you find those if you want to check them out before you watch this one again. Just a little bit about what we're doing here. This is the second, actually coming up on the end of the second year of a national initiative to look at supply chain in West Virginia and other states. The Industrial Extension is part of a national network that has colleagues in all 50 states and Puerto Rico that help small and medium-sized manufacturers. Supply chain is one of the things we haven't done a lot with in the years, and we're looking to change that. So we're working on some things with ecosystems, and also we have a program that tries to help locate supplies that you may not have a second vendor for, or you may be buying overseas, or maybe the price has gone up a little bit over time, and you want to try to find somebody new or local to kind of help you with that. Um, Today for this webinar, again, we have Adam Lowe with us. He's the owner of Orchard Street Solutions. It's a management operations and strategy consulting firm located in Baltimore, Maryland. But as I've said, we won't hold that against him. Um, he earned an MBA from WVU, is from West Virginia, has over 15 years of leadership experience in several industries, including manufacturing, hospitality, and the Marine Corps. So again, thank you for your service. Most recently, he worked at one of the world's chief defense contractors, managing several departments, including global supply chain, talent strategy, manufacturing operations, factory consumables, and outsourcing and material return groups. So he hasn't really done much, but throughout his career, Adam's always been people-oriented and process-focused with his leadership approach, and this has positioned him to be selected for several large-scale projects, including team building, stabilization, growth, development, and other strategic efforts. His process improvement strategies and sound logistical planning have led to many teams and organizations to lasting success. And what we're hoping is you'll pick up something from these webinars that'll help you all succeed and do a little better. So with that, I'm gonna be quiet and turn it over to Adam and let him do his thing.
Thank you, Dave. And again, thanks so much to the WVUIE group for inviting me in. As you said, Dave, a former West Virginia boy. I said last week, and I'll say it, from now on, I'm a West Virginian at heart. I never really left the state in those terms. So I love the fact that I'm able to come back, take some of what I've learned in the world, and then bring that back into the groups and the businesses in the state of West Virginia. As Dave said, I've been in all kinds of positions in a manufacturing and leadership roles, and what I've done is I tried to combine that in the best practices. So throughout this series, last year, as Dave mentioned, we did a 101 series. It was a very wide scale view of supply chain and what that looks like at kind of a 10,000-foot view. This year, we're moving down into maybe a 100-foot view of what supply chain looks like in your daily operations. And the main key focus is that it's not separate entities. That supply chain should be weaved into all areas of business, whether that's your business operations or your contracts or your manufacturing operations on the floor. Well, supply chain can support you in so many different ways, and those groups can support the supply chain group in so many different ways. I'll mention supply chain group, but I often know, and I've mentioned in the past couple of sessions, that you might be the one that's wearing the supply chain hat as well as your manufacturing hat or your business operations hat, and that's totally fine. So if I say supply chain group or supply chain person, it might be you, and those might be weaved together, and that's a great thing because from your perspective, those folks who get to wear a lot of the hats, you can see those dovetailing areas really cleanly and clearly. So that's kind of what I'm doing, is just pulling in those best practices and trying to give you some thoughts. We were actually discussing right before the webinar started. If folks come out of these and can apply the general basic concepts into your own operation, like that's my goal. I'm not going to get so specific that I'm talking specifically to your individual problem, most likely. I mean, hey, if I do, that's fantastic. That'd be amazing. But most likely what it's going to be is conceptual and what you might see and how you might angle and how you might be able to speak certain language and complete some more clean lines of communication and open up some of those I guess reduce some of those gaps that you may see in between the stovepiping nature of what supply chain can be and then interweaving it right into the daily operation. So that's kind of the goal of the series, and today we're moving on to the next section. So first section, well, today we're going to review. I'll do a bit of a review, and then we'll talk about how we cultivate good supplier relationships. But breaking down the review a bit, this is from session one, it was more of a breakdown of an internal supply chain operation, what that looks like to be the link on a supply chain that's a wider scale supply chain. As I said earlier, we're narrowing it down a little bit. And so really what I wanted to do is just get that base level understanding that this is a good supply chain. We talked about simplicity and goal setting and aligning goals with your higher level organization, then weaving those goal setting opportunities in with your daily manufacturing operation or your business operation and saying, all right, how do we speak the same language here and get on the same page so that we're helping each other? In session two, we talked a little bit more deeply in terms of how to make that happen. It was very heavily focused internally on your daily operation, mainly or pretty heavily between manufacturing and your supply chain roles, or maybe your storeroom functions, your receiving functions, your shipping functions, those type of things. But again, it's not to separate that out from your wider scale, even from iteration of your components and design of components and what you're going to need, weaving the supply chain mentality into that. So designing for simplicity to a degree as much as you can, but also designing for how you can bring in those good subcomponents to meet the expectations, the timelines, the budget, all that good stuff. So lots of practical advice, lots of practical operational examples from the last session. So I'd encourage you to go into session two, take a look at that if you weren't able to join with us there. And if you're brand new to supply chain, again, last year we did the 101 session. Highly encourage you to find those. I think it was 5 sessions last year, and it was just a quick, simple breakdown. I would say quick because as anybody who's been on these knows that I can be pretty long-winded, but relatively quick in breakdown of what a supply chain looks like and what it could look like for you. So if you're brand new, if you're just starting a business, or if you're just starting a manufacturing operation, take a look at those, catch up with session 1 and 2, and then you can jump right in here to what we're going to talk about today, which is building good supply relationships and what that might look like. Again, last week we talked a lot internal about how you create those good internal relationships, and this is reaching that supply chain focus outside of your company, which if you were here again for session number 1, you should be saying, wait a minute, in session 1 you told us they were a part of your operation as well, and I do believe that. I believe that anybody who's supplying you something is a part of your operation, whether or not you own that business, whether or not you own that group or not. Anything that can roll into your daily operation in as far as a mindset setting should be thought of as, hey, this is part of our operation. And what does that do? It might change the way you communicate with these groups a little bit more. If you think of them more of, we have to take some ownership over what they know, what they're doing, how they're doing it. Now, before we get too deep into it today, I want to make sure that I distinguish in terms of suppliers. And I don't think I did a great job about this last week, so I apologize about that. But when we're talking about suppliers, I don't want it to be just this conglomerate of every potential supplier you have. I did last week mention a little bit of something about if you have a supplier who's giving you cups, plates and spoons for the break room, it's a little different than the supplier that's giving you that one piece of key component that only they can build. They're the only one in the world. So what I'll try to do this week is make sure that I distinguish a little bit between the two. You have your, what I'll call general suppliers, which is for the most part, you can pretty much reach out into the communities, hopefully locally, because I'm going to pitch, staying stateside and staying in the CONUS for supplies, if possible. Just for reasons that we'll talk a little bit more about next week in the future of supply chain, what we're looking for in the future, what I believe the future will look like based on what we're seeing today. A little pitch for next week for you, so come back if you're interested in that. But making sure that you're considering those suppliers that are a little bit easier. Maybe you can kind of throw a stone and hit a supplier that's going to be able to give you what you need there. That's more of a general type of a supplier. When I talk about specialty suppliers or specialized suppliers, it's again using that framework that we've developed over the past 2 weeks of creating a very clean, clear, understandable goal that's simplistic. It's easy to discuss within your departments, and looking for how we all work together to meet those objectives and those goals. Within that, there should be some either we'll call it red flags, but maybe, maybe a microfine glass, or some sort of a deep dive into a few key areas of supply specifically. So if you do that, if you feel the need to say, ooh, what would happen if this supplier wasn't able to get it? Or what would happen if this supplier went down? Where would we get this? What would happen? I've got some examples a little later today that kind of a little bit frames that out a little bit cleaner. But if that's the case, if you've determined that a supplier that is on your rolls is going to be detrimental, and that can be because of cost. Maybe they're supplying 80% of the price, for subcomponent price for whatever you're building. If they're, the very, very heavy hitter in terms of how much money you're spending there, of course, that's going to raise that level for them. We're going to want to keep a closer eye on them. We're going to want to really work on developing those supplier relationships with that type of a company. Same thing for timeline. If you have a very specific timeline for your deliveries and you have subcomponents that may be long lead, I mean, I've seen some 2, 3, 4 years long, that it takes to design and build and bring it up into something that you're going to have a subcomponent going into one of your products. Those type, very important to keep those in that kind of specialty or specialized supplier list as well. Hopefully that's a good enough breakdown, of where I'm going with this. So again, in terms of, as we're going through these different examples and things, think through your supply list if you're in a supply chain, a role specifically, or if you're not, if you're maybe in leadership, if you're in some sort of an advisor, consultative type role, think about that, and when you're giving your advice, or when you're giving these discussions, or when you're having these discussions, how to frame out a little bit more, because we all know we don't have time to. Sometimes, I mean, some of us may, but we don't usually have time to treat every single supplier the same way. So if you're able to say, okay, here's a general supplier, and then here's a specialty supplier, it's a good distinction to make, and then that will help frame out how we relate to them, and the level of intentionality, the level of discussions, the relationship that we're trying to build. Not that you should ever just kind of kick somebody to the side and say, whatever, we'll treat them however we want to. I'll say more about that later too, because we don't want to, we don't want to be known as a bad customer, right? Because that can absolutely happen. I've seen it happen, and it does not generally end well. We want to be good customers. We want to be good suppliers if we're supplying a subcomponent to someone else. So all of these things are food for thought and angles that you can look at as we go through some of these bullet points here. So let's go ahead and start in with 3 key areas that I've kind of honed in on what we can do to help support our relationship with our suppliers. And one, just like any relationship that you have, and again, I said this last week, I'll say it again this week, treat these relationships very much like a relationship. Just because it's at work doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be much different than the relationships you may have within your daily life. The same good things that you do to support those relationships are some of the same that are going to come up in your supplier relationships. So communication, bottom line, bedrock of all relationships, good communication, clear, simple, honest, appropriate communication. And what that looks like is understanding what supplier you're talking to. Again, is it that specialty supplier? What is it that they're going to need from you to do the best job they can? Because again, this is management. This is massaging a little bit of those relationships and how they can help you get to your goals as good as you can. You should say, well, shoot, I mean, they're my supplier. They should just do what I ask them to do. Well, that's all well and good in theory and on paper. But I think, as some of us know, some of those specialty suppliers take a little bit more either communication or dedication or hand holding to get you where you need to go. So supply chain isn't necessarily, again, that set it and forget it. They're out there somewhere else. They're going to bring me my stuff. No, some of them may. Some of them may be in that kind of general supply category, but some of them may need a little bit more effort in terms of communication and what you're communicating. Honest, if there's something you need, don't just hope that they guess right. Okay. Like if you need something from your supplier, have your supplier, your vendor relations person, whoever talks to that supplier, have them let them know. Look for support, if possible. Now, I will say there's another caveat that there's proprietary information I know that we can't get. There's contractual information that I know sometimes we can't give. That type of thing is absolutely understandable. And you have to safeguard all of those good things, security, electronics, all that good stuff that we need to do our job today that we can't allow to spill over. However, being able, and if you're sitting with your supply chain hat on, understanding where those limitations are is really good. Just knowing straight away like what I can and can't say, and what is going to be to their benefit and my benefit if I have this open, simple, and appropriate, honest communication. I've said it last year in the 101 course. I'll say it again this year in this course. Appropriate conversation or appropriate communication can very much look like limited and precise. Over communication can be a problem just as much as under communication can. You start getting a little bit lost in the sauce. Multiple points of communication. If you got 5 people in your factory who may reach out to a vendor on any given day, that might be too much. You might want to think about structuring your team to where you have one POC or one prime POC and then a backup to that prime POC for who's communicating with your key vendors. Because what you don't want to have is this mixed communication where, Susie calls in and says, this is a priority. We need 25 of these by the end of week next week. Please get them to us. And then you have Johnny call in 10 hours later the next day and say, no, don't worry about those 25. That's not really important. Again, that's goes back into what we talked about last week is that interdepartmental communication that needs to happen in a good flowing operation where supply chain is dovetailed in nicely. And then the outworking of that is the example I just gave. You might have multiple people when you don't have that good internal communication and your goals and your priorities aren't set up really nicely and there's internal communication isn't going well. That's generally speaking when I've seen those miscommunications or those directives that are giving from multiple folks to a single vendor. And then you have that vendor come back and say, listen, what in the world's going on over there? Like, that's not what you want to have happen. So having some sort of streamline, again, specifically with those high level or those specialty vendors is key. And understanding who is the prime POC and do they have what I've seen work in the past, and again, it depends on what kind of time you have and the importance of you have to deduce that for yourself. But having a weekly meeting, bi-weekly meeting, monthly meeting to say, all right, we're going to be communicating again with this key vendor. Let's bring all parties to the table who may have something to say about this. Let's get us on the right marching orders, right path, and let's set them up a schedule that gets them to green, that gets them to a really successful place for us. Because if they don't, we can go down, with that ship. We don't want that to happen. So again, just simple, honest, clear communication and appropriate communication with that one POC. Again, if you need multiple POCs, if there's multiple product lines, it doesn't negate the fact that you need to get on the same page. I mentioned that last week. If you have multiple product lines coming out of a specific vendor, you still want to make sure that they know those priorities. You want to rack and stack that internally in your own operation. If you have a vendor who's sending you 20 different part numbers on any given day or any given week, and they've got, let's say 50 different purchase orders out there for those 20 different part numbers, you want to definitely make sure you're sending the appropriate communication, racking and stacking what is the priority. You can base that on if you have a really good contract system that is very clean, clear, and concise with the dates, and you know that those dates are legit from a long time off, then great. That's good. Maybe that's all they need. You might just want to point them back to that and say, hey, in line with these POs that we have coming in, we want to make sure just for our warm and fuzzies and your warm and fuzzies that you're working on the right stuff. We got these coming in. Let's make sure we keep those as your priorities. No more to talk about there, but I could go on a lot about community. As you can tell, I like communicating, so that's one of my key functions and key thoughts when I'm thinking through that vendor relation. So collaboration. So help them help you and vice versa. This is really important too, because and again, this is more focused in on your specialty vendors that you have. When they, going back a little bit to the communication piece, when they have something that they're working on internally, and they may not understand what will benefit you the best, and then also too, they might have problems. So if they don't feel comfortable coming back to you with a problem, what that might look like, and I would just say assess your operation to see if this happens for you. You have a vendor who's supposed to be delivering you at a 6-month purchase order coming in. It's supposed to be coming in next week, and they call you 2 days in advance and say, we aren't going to be able to meet that date. And they continually do this, or maybe they've done this a couple of times, and they said, we're not going to be able to meet that date. We're going to be 2 weeks late. So you very well could just say, listen, this vendor they're subpar. We need to start looking for vendor number 2. If you have those open communication lines and you can go back into them and say, what's the deal? It just seems like this is hard. Every now and then you all come up and you don't have whatever. You don't meet that date. Perhaps they have a supply chain issue themselves. Maybe they have a piece of material that is a subcomponent of their subcomponent for you that is hard to get. Let's call it an epoxy. Let's say it's an epoxy or it's some sort of a glue. Well, you might very well have that glue on your shelf. And maybe if they knew that, you could just say, well, shoot, if that's all you're needing, we've got a solution for you. So opening up those lines of communication to be able to talk about those struggles together, especially with your key vendors, again, those specialty vendors, that can help them. You're giving them a part that they're struggling to get in. Um, to help you in return. So looking for those opportunities rather than just throwing away that supplier, that vendor, may be something that could help within your operation. Again, how much time do you have to spend on that kind of support? I don't know, but if that's part of your criteria for your supply chain person is to look for those type of opportunities, especially with your key vendors. Perhaps that's a good way of setting up their daily work or their work and what is expected of a vendor relationship, what is expected out of a vendor relationship, and what is expected of your vendor relationship primary POC. So just something to think about how you can look at helping them help you and vice versa. And then also given some grace. This can save you money in the long run. A quick example here is, if you have a vendor that you know that the material coming in isn't needed for 6 months, but you have a delivery date 6 months early because you like to get all of your stuff in up front. Maybe that's your build structure and your cycle on the floor. That's great, fine. Let's say they're having a real struggle getting it in, right? And they're saying, well, I know we're contractually obligated to get it to you January 1st, but we're having some trouble being able to say, well, shoot, you know what? I can look at my internal processes and give them some vendor relief, give them a little bit of relief on that contract date. And, that helps when it comes to negotiations. That helps when it comes to your next iteration of whatever you're building. Like, remember those things and create those good opportunities to create that foundational relationship with that vendor to say, hey, you know what? We'll be happy to give you some leeway on that or can you change maybe your deliveries? Maybe we don't need 500 at once. Maybe we need 100 at once, and we'll do it in 5 iterations. We'll do it in 5 deliveries, things like that, and giving them some grace there. On the tail end, when you really need some support and you really need some things in, it's going to be a lot easier to leverage that good relationship you have to say, hey, we're struggling. We're backs against the wall. We really need your help here. Whatever that might look like in the future. So rather than just flipping vendors quickly or whatever. And again, this is again leaning a little bit more into those specialty vendors, but instead of just flipping vendors and getting rid of them because they're not, they're subpar, they're not getting it here 6 months in advance, whatever. Thinking through creative ways to help strengthen those vendor relationships can help you in the long run by not having to source that next vendor because it's not cheap to do that. A lot of the times it's getting components into test and tearing them up and doing all that kind of thing so that you can make sure that it's got the quality of the new vendor and all those different things. All that might be able to be avoided if you look for unique and creative solutions internally. So goals is the third point here. So setting logistically sound goals together. So again, I always say logistical goals because just saying setting goals sounds great, and you can make these goals on paper and they can look fantastic. But if there's no real chance in the in the world of them actually working out, or if you know that there's some key real world items that you're going to have to hurdle, that's where the logistics come around. So make sure you're planning for logistics. I always do that little plug no matter what speech I'm giving. But I think that's really important in setting goals is making sure they're logistically possible and what is the most likely thing that's going to happen as you work things out and creating some contingencies along the way if you find those big hiccups. But setting those goals together when you're having those communication points with your vendors, setting those goals together can help you understand what might be their hiccups, right? It might not even be your hiccup that you're trying to accommodate. It might be one on their side. Well, they might say, well, during January and February, we have a drastic increase in orders for whatever reason. And so, they might struggle in January and February to hit your quotas. Well, maybe you have the leeway to be able to say, well, no worries. We can just order in October and November, give you December as a leeway, and then we'll double up our orders then. Can you accommodate that? Well, sure. Yeah, we don't have as many orders, so that actually help them out too. So they can continue to get you what you need and you won't be, behind during January, February when they hit their spike, and maybe they're not able to deliver as regularly as you would like. Navigating order reductions and then increasing wisely. So that's kind of navigating how you place your orders. I spoke a little bit about that in the last example. I won't beat this one to death, but just increases and decreases in your orders from vendors, making sure that they have the capacity essentially, or if you're going to sync them, if you don't, maybe you're going to decrease orders by 90% for 2 years just because you're switching to a different product line, but you're going to switch back to that other product line in a couple of years. Well, if you have a key vendor and maybe you're a heavy hitter on their radar, maybe you want to forecast that to them and say, what can we do to help keep you afloat as our key vendor? over those 2 years, or what can we do maybe to order a little bit early? If there's no fear of latent defect, maybe you have the ability to carry a little bit of that cost, and you can order some parts of those components over the next 2 years. So that way you've got them in slowly. You're not pushing out too much cash for them, and then you're in a good spot in a couple of years, and your vendor isn't sunk because one of their key customers is gone. Just little things like that that you can look at, and making sure you're communicating that to your key vendors. Um, Planning short and long, again, it's in the same vein there. Making sure that you're looking downstream at what they're able to do, making sure they're looking as far as like being able to communicate, hey, it's our goal, vendor A, that we're going to ramp up by 900% over the span of the next 3 years. Are you going to be able to handle that? And if not, maybe they say, you know what, it's just not worth it for us. Or maybe they say, yeah, it would be if we were able to get some more equipment in here. And who knows, maybe there's an opportunity there to even leverage some of your cash to help them build over time, make it worth their while to help them build up their capabilities in a contractual way. Again, I'm not in the legal department, so don't ask me deep questions about contracts and what that needs to look like legally. But maybe there's some ways that you can help that vendor build up into what they need to be, support them in that, and then guess what you become? You become their very favorite customer. You become that order they're never going to drop because you help them build it up, or at least for a long time until they forget, as we all have a tendency maybe to do over years. But showing them that you're willing to be there as a good support, especially again, if they're a key vendor of yours, looking for opportunities to be able to keep that. Or you say this is great, maybe you're 50% of it, and then you outsource the other 50% to a different vendor. Things like that are always options, but just being clear and open with what your needs are with your vendors, and then helping them to plan their long-term goals and their long-term deliveries, and including the short-term. How do we build there? Putting those stepping stones down, helping them in that can just show how good of a customer you are, as well as good of a vendor, because the word gets out. When you're supplying somebody else as well, and you're looking for these opportunities to be the very best that you can be in terms of communication, treating your vendors well, being a good customer as well as a good supplier. Those, especially to the big companies, that word gets out very quickly. I can promise you that word gets out very quickly. I've worked at a very large manufacturing organization for several years now, and we know the word gets out about vendors who will bend over backwards to support you and their own vendors as well. It's just good to work with folks like that. So mimicking that within your own operations can be definitely a leveraging point for future business. All right, next. This one I have a tendency to go deep into. I will try to pull back a little bit today. We're about 30 minutes in now, so I know we got about 30 minutes left. So I won't go too deep into here. But this is just, again, it's food for thought and ways that you can look within your own network areas to grow your supply base, to grow your potentially your customer base. And so I always like to talk about tapping our own networks and sources for growth. So networks and sources that are already at your fingertips, and then some of those that you might not even have thought about. Giving time to future thought is really important. I'll talk about that when we talk about the potential section. So what we're going to focus on here is like, what is and who are your networks and who are your sources? So it's very easy to think, well, of course, it's online. I'll go to Google and I'll Google who can sell me some X, Y, and Z. That's fine. That's 100% a way of doing it. You can also go to all kinds of. I'll give a plug for Dave and the Scoin project that they've got going on. They can absolutely be a source, a fantastic source for many different things in your operation, but especially in that as well. But hoping or helping you to connect to those vendors. So definitely reach out to your network and your source. And Dave and the IE group here, WVU IE group, they can help you to make those connections too. That's a networking. That's a resource that you have. You also have internal resources, your employees, your data sets that you have internally. If you're capturing those data sets, I've talked a little bit about it last week, and I couldn't preach any more on this. But being able to collect that data and be so that you can analyze it is going to help you make driven decisions that are based off of reality and not just a guess. So that internal data can it can inform you as to who those vendors are that are already on your vendor rolls, who are meeting their historic goals. And talk about historic knowledge. That's things, 2 years ago we had a vendor burn us. maybe we don't go back to that vendor, or maybe we're at least very cautious, and maybe we look back at those contracts that we had with that vendor that burned us 2 years ago and say, if we're willing to go back here, these are the things that have to be on the table in order for us to move forward with some sort of a contract with you. Things like that is historic knowledge. That's data and network and sources internally that you can use to inform how you manage your vendors. In the last example, obviously, you're going to have to put a little bit maybe stricter terms on those contracts. Or it could just say opportunities for who. Hey, you got 50 employees out there on the floor. Guess what they know? They know people. So if those 50 know 50 and they know 50 and they know 50, use your employees as a source, especially if you're looking to stay stateside or to have those closer networks of supply, because everybody's got to, I mean, I know, believe me, coming from West Virginia, everybody knows everybody. And so somebody's going to know, there's a likelihood that somebody's going to know of or have heard of somebody who can get you that thing that you need. You need screws, you need some sort of maybe welding work done, you need somebody's got a buddy who knows somebody. So using them and tapping them as a network. But the thing is again, like I said on the last page, if they don't know, how will they be able to offer that up? I've even seen people offer up programs internally, and this is an idea for you, offer up programs internally to say, hey, if you lead us to a source, if you lead us to a vendor who we go with, there's a $500 bill in there for you, or something, some sort of an incentive program that says, hey, you're going to be our network. We want to reward you for that good knowledge. We want to reward you for those things you're bringing to the table. There's many different ways you can point that internally as well. It doesn't have to just be for your suppliers and opening up your supplier base, but that can be one way you do that. Gets that information out. It gets the employees involved. That could be somebody that's doing welding for you in your operation on the floor. They tell you, hey, I've got a buddy that does X, Y, and Z. You end up going with that buddy. It shows them that you're listening, shows them that you care about their opinions and what they're looking at. And it helps get that networking going internally as well as externally. So, and then processes and practices as well. Internally, you can look at that and see how you're able to build and what you're building or what you're selling or what you're doing. That can inform the type of vendors you need to look at as well and the type of relationship you have. Again, I mentioned it last week. If you can get in on the front side of your development in your product, and you can start laying out some maybe wider specs or margins within some of the things, that opens up your vendor possibilities. That's part of your processes and practices to say, hey, design team, maybe there's ways that we can design a little bit more to be open to more sourcing for suppliers and vendors. So just something to think about at all stages and all levels of your operation, to think through who that network is and what you can do with that data, those resources, to make better decisions and to go out and find those sources for your vendors. External, of course, you have current suppliers, and this is something. One note I'd like to make here is your whoever is doing your supply chain operation, in my opinion, should have some guidelines or at least some best practices for listening. Being a good listener and knowing what to listen for in these different relationships, like your vendor relationships, or when you're selling, or when you've got your customers, whoever that may be, a consultant or even a competitor, being able to listen to what their pain points are, listening to what their solutions have been, can open up a world of possibilities. You might start to notice everybody keeps going to this one supplier for this certain thing. Why is it? And that just opens up your ears and it says, well, I need to look into that, because they must be doing something right if I'm hearing this from multiple angles. So if you're sitting in a global supply chain or a supply chain seat, and that is part of your hat that you wear, being able to open up your ears and listen to that, whether it be with your current suppliers, a lot of the times they will connect you with other folks. Consultants are great. Consultants like me, like my goal is to help you do as good as you can possibly do in any area. So if I have networks and I have information, and you say, I was just thinking about this thing. And say I'm coming in to consult for management or operations management. And you say, we are also kind of struggling a little bit with our supplier base, or with our, they very well could be like, well, hey, I've got some contacts for you. They might be a great, because their goal is to help you they want to come back. I'll tell you right now, consultants want to come back for more business, right? So they might be the one that links you in with a certain supplier that's going to be the answer to some of your problems. So, if you have that type of a relationship with your consultants or with your current suppliers, customers, those type of things, those are great sources of information for how you can expand your supply base in your operation in terms of global supply chain or supply chain. I won't go any more into the external. We'll talk a little bit about the potential. So this is where I was talking about having that this inquisitive and this curious nature as a supply chain person, if that's part of your role as sourcing, or if that's part of your role as reaching out and communication with suppliers, thinking through what might be, what could be, are there unknown markets that we could tap that may be able to give us a solution that we hadn't thought of because we're thinking so strictly in our own purview that we lose sight of these other vendors who may be able to give us something similar. For instance, I mean, literally just in the hotel today, I'm actually offsite. If you can tell, I'm not in my home studio. I am outside. I'm in the real world. But just down, and I thought of this as an example. When I went to go get ice, there was baggies that aren't designed for ice hanging right beside the ice machine that are designed for sports use, for sports equipment. So it's a baggie that's used to hold ice, but not in a hotel setting. But somebody had the wherewithal, somebody had the foresight to say, we need baggies, we need to look them up. Who could do this? Where could they go? Where could we get them in bulk? Where could they be on a certain roll and all that? Well, they ended up going in something that wasn't necessarily in the hotel sphere, but worked perfectly. And that's just a great example of how when you think through and you're a little bit more inquisitive as a supply chain person looking for those potential solutions, you have a world of possibilities. So don't think in such a limited capacity that we can only solve a problem within the scoping of our business or within the scoping of our own market. How can we potentially develop our own products internally? I've seen that as a solution in many cases. Somebody looks out on their manufacturing floor and says, "Daggone it, we've got such a difficult problem getting these." Maybe it's a mold created. It's a wooden mold or a metal mold, and we use it to put piece parts together and fix it. And you have a welder and you've got other machines that, wait a minute, if we put those things together, we can make our own molds. We don't have to buy them from this company. And then it gives us a lot more opportunities to pivot. Like, maybe your supplier can only do a certain type of a mold for you. Maybe they can only do a certain type of a design for you. Well, you might have more flexibility internally if you just open up your thoughts and say, daggone it, this has been a problem for us. We're getting that word out to our community and our networks, and we're saying, hey, can somebody think of a solution that might be out of the box that could help us here? So just some ways of thinking through, and just that kind of internal nature of what you can have as a foundation as a supply chain person to think a little bit outside of the box for solutions, and that might look like actually something brand new that you've never really thought about. And the only way you're going to get there is if you get outside of that box. All right. And then finally, we're going to jump in and say, let data lead the way. Now, this definitely dovetails in with next week. So I'm going to reserve some of my futuristic talk until then. Again, if you're interested in that type of thing of where we may be going, I would definitely encourage you to come back next week. We're going to talk about everything from robotics to machine learning to AI solutions and all kinds of fun stuff. So if you're interested in that, come on back. But for today, we're going to talk about our internal data and setting up your data systems to get for success, so that you can make those data-driven solutions. You can have those data-driven solutions and find those key components of things that might be happening in a hidden way. You can start to use your data and leverage that data to find those areas where you might need to improve. And I'm sure, again, giving another pitch to Dave and his folks, this is very much in the heart of that more lean type of an operation. It's very much in the heart of the constant solutions, the constant improvement type of operations that they can definitely help with if you're looking at that type of thing. They have a fantastic team there, who I've worked with on a number of occasions. Just kind of like Dave said, just spitballing and talking. This is right in line with that same mentality of constant improvement, constant growth, and looking at how do we every day get a little bit better. And that's basically taking a data system and allowing it to capture reality, and then being able to leverage that into actionable moves within your organization. So data capture and documenting processes is very big. I mentioned it last week. If you have that key person on your team and their processes aren't documented, it's really hard when they leave, they win the lottery and walk out, to sometimes to replicate that, because you don't know all of the bits and bobs that they were doing in order to make their world go. So being able to capture that in some sort of a documented process is extremely important. Same thing with your supply chain group. I mean, it's no different than what you would do out there on the manufacturing floor. You have work instructions on the manufacturing floor. You should have work instructions in your supply chain group and what they're doing to use those networks, like we talked about on the last slide. What does that look like? What does their vendor communication look like? What is the data that might be needing should be known for a vendor. If they walk away and they're no longer managing that vendor, what's some key components of that relationship? What did it look like, and what do they need to know? All of that being captured in some sort of a documented process, electronic, that is open and visible, and sometimes it's in a physical nature if it's more online with like your receiving department. A physical nature of data capture can just be, how do we mark down what we've gotten and got it done correctly. And it could be, well, we stack our boxes a certain way to know that we got everything in that we needed from a vendor. That's kind of a physical nature of data capture. And that again goes right in line with lean, kind of a lean environment, more of a visual of how you capture your data. Can be really good for folks on the floor. You pretty well known. If there's no box sitting where a box should be, you're missing something, right? Well, that's data. And what do you do about that? Again, that's how you drive to solutions. I won't go any more in there. I could go really do a deep dive in an MRP system, a more formal MRP system. I won't do that. You can replicate that too if you're a smaller operation as far as being able to capture data. But what I would plug is having some sort of a way to capture data. I mean, it can be a Microsoft Teams option, or it could be some sort of a Microsoft, Excel that's open to other people, or Google Documents option to where you can capture data in a certain way that most people within your organization can be able to see. Because you never really know when you're getting something in supply chain, some piece of data, and you might think, well, this is just good for me, but why would anybody care in manufacturing? Well, they might say, well, good grief, that can help us change our scheduling. It can help us do not only what we schedule to go on our manufacturing lines, but who we're bringing in and how we're bringing them in and how many people we need to hire in order to. All of those type of things can be very extremely useful to your whole operation. Again, I'm not going to go into detail there. That was more in last week's webinar. But go back in and look at some of those opportunities that you have to base your organization on a more open, wide network of data collection, so that you can make those data-driven decisions. Again, capturing that data leads right nicely into making your metrics. Metric creation is really important. I've seen both schools of thought, or a lot of schools of thought, let's say, on metrics creation. But I think metrics are great when they are useful, and when they are simple, and when they are aligned with your goals, and when they're actionable. I think metrics for the sake of having a chart to show somebody, the way I look at it is if you can't pull a lever and have something happen within your metric, or whatever you're capturing, or maybe a number of levers, but you have a pretty clear explanation of when I do this, that can happen. When it gets too convoluted, then the metric basically goes out the window. If you pull levers and you can't tell if the metric goes up or goes down, or it gets better, it gets worse, or whatever, then to me, I would at least give serious consideration to scrapping the metrics and starting again. And I know how it happens. It evolves, and somebody says, you've got a great metric here on your, let's see, your incoming material. One of your metrics is, what is our on time to delivery metric? So that's all of your vendors that's coming in. You've got a data sheet that shows when they get here. Let's say you scan it on your dock. It feeds into a data sheet. Every piece of material that comes in, every piece of vendor material that comes in, gets scanned in. It says what time it got here, when it got here, and all this good stuff. And then you can rack and stack. You can do pivot tables, and you can find out who's meeting their deadlines. You can feed all that information in there too, and it's great. And then all of a sudden somebody says, oh, that's a good metric that you got there. Can you just tweak it a little bit for my purposes? And somebody else says, tweak this a little bit for my purposes. And the next thing you know, it's this monstrosity of a metric, and you got 40 different, buttons you can push or levers you can pull. And when you do, sometimes your metric gets better and sometimes it gets worse, and you just never really know. I would say simplicity in metrics is the key. Can you point and say, yeah, when our vendors don't deliver on time, this metric goes this way. When our vendors do deliver on time, it goes this way. Because what that does is that allows you to take that data and drive your decisions. Maybe you go back to that key vendor list versus your general vendor list. And guess what? Maybe what you find out is because you've got an aggregate amount of data, and you're able to pull some quick levers within your spreadsheet and say, you know what? We've got 10 vendors who we've highlighted as our specialty vendors. They're killing it. They're doing great. They're on time, no problems whatsoever. Well, why are we moving so slow out there on the floor then? Then why are we having these vendors there? Well, maybe it's in that other, 90% of your vendors, let's say, one or two of them are just driving that down. It's your nitrile gloves of all things, or it's your epoxies of all things that should have been here on time over and over again. But because you're able to collect your data and see which vendors are delivering on time, you might say, well, shoot, gosh, now we need to have a real discussion of, do we keep this vendor or not? I mean, we can throw a stone and hit any vendor, and this one continually over the past 6 months has been late, 70% of the time. it may be worth a discussion, or it may be worth, let's go to vendor B. Just immediate decision. Boom. Vendor B, hey, listen, just letting you know, this is what the problem we've been having. We've had late deliveries for the past XYZ months. We're looking for you to come online. I know you're maybe a little bit more expensive, maybe the same price, but if you can meet those deliveries, you're our guy. You're our vendor. You're who we're going to go with. They might say, shoot, yeah, we can get there. We can get it there a day early. Whatever it is, you've created a solution there just because you've got a good, simple system. You've got a good way of pulling your data in, you've made those data-driven decisions, and you've resolved a problem for your manufacturing group or on the floor. You're able to move through a little bit more quickly. If you're not gathering that data and you've got 100 vendors, let's say, it makes it really hard to see what's causing this slowdown. And somebody might be hollering out there on the floor, it's the man, we're not getting our material. Well, which material? Well, maybe because of the build process, it might be obscured. You might not really know exactly what it is. It's just every other day it's one piece part that's not there in time, or it's not in the place it's supposed to be. Again, some of that could be just internal operations issues, but some of it very well could be that your vendors aren't delivering on time, and it's just been obscured because you're not pulling that data in. Again, won't continue to beat that dead horse, but as you can see, I get a little passionate about that. Now that was part of my main role in one of my last positions, so I got really it did some real deep dives on that and found so many opportunities for growth and success based off of some vendors that just weren't, that the data wasn't being captured really well. So I would encourage you, if you're looking for opportunities to streamline, to look there and make sure your vendors, all of them, are delivering on time to the best of your ability. And if they're not, what does that do? And then how can you maybe pull deliveries? Maybe it is a specialty vendor. Maybe you order 2 weeks in advance. Maybe you hold a little bit more in. Maybe you increase the quantity of your POs to cover some of the vendor quality issues that you're seeing. Lots of decisions can be made once you have that data and you're driving your decisions based off of that data. It's like we have about 13 minutes left. I'm going to try to leave some time. So if you're thinking of any questions or things like that, go ahead and jot them down. I'll save some time here at the end. We can answer questions too. So for the last part of letting your data lead the way, creating an action plan. Now, you can look at a million different manufacturing support books or management leadership books and find different action plan. I'll give you a breakdown of mine. I won't belabor it because there's so many opportunities here for growth and might be more tailored to your individual operation. But let's go through at least what I would say as a very simplistic format that you can put in place that'll definitely help you make an action plan. So first is just analyzing that data. Key is getting the data, having it, understanding where it is and what you can do with it. Once you've got that, then you can analyze it. You can go to and say, well, what's important about this? What can we throw away? What's some data that's not going to be important to us? Now, before you throw it away, check your key stakeholders who are looking at the data. Again, if it's a centralized location, you don't want to chuck some of the data out the window and say, well, this isn't important to us. And you might have a whole other department out there that's like, oh no, where did it go? So make sure you get everybody, all your key stakeholders who could be looking at the data together and say, what is important to us as a group? What do we want to keep going on in here? What do we want to have here as a foundation for the information we're basing our decisions off of? Again, because that's going to help you to make decisions that weave nicely together when you're all working off of the same key data. Won't always be that clean and clear. I mean, I know I'm talking in kind of an idealistic way. However, the cleaner, the simpler you can do this, the more standard and sound your platform will be for making those decisions. So analyze your data, create some simple benchmarks as to where you want to be within your data. So if it's again using the vendor delivery metric, if you're saying we want all of our vendors to be, let's say we break it into our two subsets. We got these 10 vendors here that are our key vendors. We got these 90 over here that are our general vendors. We want our 90 vendors to be at 99.8% on-time delivery. Again, because you can pull a trigger real quick and get another vendor in for those. Generally speaking, you can do that. You can make some quick changes and you can change those folks out. Now for your specialty vendors, these are the ones that maybe you pour over the data a little bit more. Maybe it's a little bit more intricate. Maybe for both sets, you have a checklist of all the things that we need. For you to be on our vendor list, you need to at least be able to meet these particular criteria. And when you stop meeting those criteria, we're going to look for somebody else. Or then you have your specialty, the same, maybe another list that's more detailed, more intricate on what your key vendors need to do to help you out and what kind of relationship you need to build with them in order to make sure everybody's successful. But when you do that, you can create some benchmarks for them. And then you have maybe triggers when they're not meeting those benchmarks. You have triggers that are in place that say, this is what we need to do with that vendor to help them get back to green, get back on time on their delivery, whatever it is. I'm being a little bit specific, but you can kind of use this as a concept for many different angles and metrics and goals and areas that you can look at. So creating some simplistic benchmarks and then building your plan based off of that. Again, that's using that data to allow you to make data-driven decisions. So you analyze, you benchmark, then you build a plan and implement it. Now, a key part of the implementation is training, is explaining the plan. Last week I talked a lot about using the language of the folks who are impacted. So finding those, reaching through that fence line and those gates, finding those people who are impacted, using that RACI that we talked about last week. If you're unfamiliar, jump back into last week and check that out. Using that RACI to find out who needs to be informed about these different things, and then who needs to be, so that's the education piece. This is what we're doing. This is how we're using this metric. This is the plan we've created based off of our metrics, reaching through and then implementing it. And I couldn't stress this anymore. Don't just leave it there. One of the benchmarks should be, when do we go back and revisit? When do we go back and look at this again? Is it every week, every 2 weeks, every month, once every 6 months, whatever that looks like? Have a systematic plan in place with somebody who is specifically tapped on the shoulder to do those reviews so that you understand whether or not that system is continuing on forward. You make iterations off of it based off of how well you're doing with that system, and then you make improvements off of that. It's a very simplistic action plan, but if you put these things in place and you put calendar reminders and you have a specific plan of review, this is going to help so much with the improvement on how your vendors can operate, what kind of communication. Again, simplistic, easy communication. You'll get some of those talking points from this data that you'll go back to your vendors. You'll be so much more informed when you're having those vendor discussions to say, hey, it's looking like you're not hitting this. It looks like you've got this type of quality issue. Maybe we need to look at, what that can be. Do they foot some of the bill for that quality issue? Let's say if 20% of their parts are coming in broken or whatever that might look like. Those discussions can be had when you're able to say, I can show you the data right here. This is how we measure it. This is the metrics. This is how we capture it. This is the incoming material. This is it makes it really hard for any vendor to say, well, that wasn't us or whatever. Not that you're trying to pinpoint, not that you're trying to point the finger. Both parties should be hoping to get on the same level playing field so that you can both work together to make each other better. But coming back and say, hey, we really need some help here. It looks like we're having this issue. It looks like we're having that issue. Data-driven decisions and an action plan based off of data is how you get there. That's how you truly make those long-lasting, successful changes. All right, and beyond that, I think it's got about 7 minutes left, Dave, if you're still on the line there. It was my goal to leave a little bit of time, so actually, man, I did it. Normally it's right up against the edge, but today we have some time for questions.
Congratulations. If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or just put them in the chat and I can ask Adam. In the meantime, I think, Adam, this one hit home most with me because if you ask anybody in our group, I'm a bit of a data nerd. I've worked in small manufacturing shops and I've worked with several of them through this job. And so many times you make a decision, you do something because it's the heat of the moment or it's the soup of the day or the flavor of the week. Cheryl asked if the recording will be available to participants. Yes, it will be available. Tracy will be sending that information out after we're done. Yeah, when you start collecting that data and you look back, you can start finding those trends and seeing things that you forgot about. I know the older I get, I can't remember what I did last week, let alone 6 months ago.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But that data is so important. And I've seen in a fab shop I worked in, it drove a lot of changes for us. When we started tracking on-time deliveries, late deliveries, and we were just a small piece of the puzzle, but it helped us to realize, hey, okay, we can, if they won't play ball with us, if they won't have those conversations with us, it at least tells us we need to build a safety net. So maybe we order a little extra each time. So, obviously when you talk about lean and CI, you don't want to have stock on hand that you don't need.
Sure.
But that's the fine line you walk. Do you have that and have the material you need, or do you run thin and hope for the best?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like you said, I mean, Dave, you and I could go on for hours and hours about this, but I couldn't agree. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it just gives you much more, more arrows in your quiver, right? Of what
Yeah.
you can actually do to support yourselves And maybe you never have to pull that arrow out, but it's better to have it there than to not. And the way that you create those solutions for yourself in advance and be more forward thinking is by having the ability to know what true reality is and not just guesstimate and not just kind of think, well, that's, and also too, you mentioned something about trend lines, and I meant to mention this earlier, so I'm so glad that you said that. That's part of that, like being able to, as a supply chain person, to be able to understand those delivery trend lines. You might have a vendor that for 8 of 12 months is stellar, and then all of a sudden, a couple months they're down, and maybe it's 2 times in the year. And if you can track this and say, man, they're on time, on time, on time, and then they dip another month, and then they get back to on time. You can have that conversation with it. What in the world's going on here? You all are normally way on time, but a couple months, and they can go back into their data, hopefully, and their framework and say, oh, here's why. And you can say, well, shoot, here's how we help you out. The month before, we're going to order X, like you said, make those order changes, or you put in a split order and you're able to get half at the beginning of the month, half at the end of the month. And then you don't have to run out and start saying, well, daggone it, they're never good in this time. Well, maybe they're never good, but maybe they're good 8 months out of the year, and you just need
Yep.
to come up with a creative solution. And being able to watch those trend lines from historic data gives you that opportunity to have those kind of questions. When you don't have it, it's you're guessing. And what you may do is that knee-jerk reaction. These folks all the time, they never deliver. Let's go to somebody else. Well, maybe the part is more expensive. Maybe their deliveries are just as bad. And you won't know that for another year or 2 years because you won't have that. You'll just have to wait until you get that, that feeling in your gut that makes you not happy about the next one. So, put something in place
Okay.
that's simplistic that helps you see that on paper is extremely helpful for those type of
We
decisions.
got we have a question from the crowd. It's a really good one.
Fantastic.
In your experience, what's the most important metric or metrics the manufacturer should be tracking related to supply chain, and what actions should be tied to them? Can you elaborate on a scenario where a key metric becomes actionable?
The key, I mean, well, it all boils down to the cost or to the question of the question du jour. What do you care more about, cost or timeline? Which is pretty much the epitome. I think some of this will depend on what your answer to that question is in your own operation. So think through that. Think through what your goals are and which one's higher. Are you more concerned about the cost? Are you more concerned about the timeline? And I know we all want to say, well, I'm concerned about both. So here's my answer to this. My answer to this one is that to me, um, on time delivery, and that's the reason why I kind of harped on that one a little bit, is probably the most important because of all the hidden costs that can happen when it's not on time. So what do you have to do out on your manufacturing? Because again, remember, we're not two separate stovepiped organizations. It's not manufacturing and supply chain ends where manufacturing begins. If you don't get your material on time, that domino gets tipped over in the wrong direction. So somebody's got to accommodate something, whether that's changing up the schedule or not, or having people set on budget, or that type of thing can happen. So my personally, I believe, and it also depends on what kind of operation you have. So if you're just in time, then especially on time delivery. So if you're a just in time factory and that's how you operate, and you have these deliveries that have to be made on the day or right around the day that they're needed so that they can be whisked right away onto the floor, and then they can go right into the operation. If you're not that, you could talk about cost being one, and that might leverage a little bit more of your decisions. But as far as I would be concerned, and so what are some actions that are tied to those? Well, again, it is when in terms of discussions. So being armed with that information that you have a vendor that isn't on time. Again, there and in this scenario, I'm using one of your key vendors. If not, if it's not a key vendor, let's just knock that one out real quick. Start looking for other vendors that'll be able to do it, and make that part of your initial discussion. So if it's just a general vendor, and you found that not being on time is what's caused you a lot of heartache, on day one, when you have that first conversation with that vendor, that's one of the first things you need to talk about. What are your on-time metrics? How good are you all at delivering? If I was going to order 10,000 of these from you, can you guarantee me you're going to get it on time? That's one question that you'd have with them. So that's one of the levers that you can pull. If it's a key vendor that you can't get rid of, now that's a little bit more delicate. That might take some hey, bring them into your factory, you go into their factory on site. That face-to-face conversation can mean a lot, especially if you're a heavy hitter in their world. And you show up and you say, we need to talk about this. Maybe just that can be a big enough trigger to them to say, dag on it, this is one we need to be on time on. So just there's a plethora of ways that you can manage that depending on your relationship with that manager. But having those open and frank conversations, again, none of what I was saying wasn't saying being very professional and frank. If they're going to lose your business, they need to know that, or if there's the potential for them to lose it. Now, I would have something in my hip pocket before I would not threaten that, but before I would say, hey, listen, your actions are going to force us to go elsewhere if you can't get it on time. So what can we do to help you get it on time? And maybe they say, well, if you were able to in your margin to order it a month sooner, that would help us to give us a month of a buffer to make sure we're pretty good. Or hey, if you can order twice a month as opposed to one lump sum a month, we just can't build that fast for whatever reasons, because of their build schedules or whatever. So I would say, and I hope that answers the question. So if you can write back and let us know if that answered it.
Yep, I gotta thank you. It sounds like a
Yeah.
chalk one up for Adam.
Okay. Got one down. All right. Yeah. Great question though. Fantastic.
Definitely helpful. So I'm glad it was helpful for you.
Sure.
We're a 1 minute past. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. And thank everybody for participating. Adam, thank you again for another great session. And don't forget, we have the fourth and final session in this set next Thursday, same time, same channel. So we'll look forward to hearing about the future of AI and what we can do to play in that arena.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dave, and all. Appreciate y'all coming, and hopefully it was good. Hopefully you can take some of these and go off and do great things.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.